welcome back to the Investor Professor podcast. This is Dr. Ryan Peckham, and this is episode 127. We're getting out of our element today. Got a midweek mini episode author series here where we're going to talk about Robert A. Caro and his books about power, specifically through Robert Moses of New York and President LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. And I found these books fascinating for a multitude of reasons that I'm going to try to break down for you today. So get your mind right and let's get to work. Well, thank you again, everybody, for joining me here on this mini episode covering the author Robert A. Caro. Just a tremendous individual whose discipline and dedication is something that I really honed in on this. And so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, just to discuss these books, kind of some of the lessons from them. If you're watching on YouTube, you will see these massive volumes in front of me here, and just kind of discuss this a little bit. So Robert A. Caro, who's currently 88 years old, he has done 4 volumes on Lyndon Johnson, and he's currently working on the 5th one. And so the first one was published in 1982, and he's still not done. And so I really want to kind of hone in on that, on the dedication that he has put into this and the discipline that it has taken. So I find myself, as I get older, kind of gravitating to these kind of things where I see people who are basically dedicating their life to something and drawing inspiration from that. And I think that is one of the main takeaways for me on this, besides the lessons that I learned reading these books and you know his breakdown of Robert Moses of New York and LBJ is just, and why I want to spend some time on it up front here, is just the amount of dedication that it has taken him, the amount of research that it's taken him. You know, he's from New York, and when he started working on these LBJ books, I mean, he literally moved down to the hill country for 10 years to do research, live amongst people who knew Lyndon B. Johnson, family members of his, cousins of his brother, to try to get their trust, to show that like he really was dedicated to this, going to the LBJ Presidential Library, going through boxes and boxes and boxes, literally one page at a time, turning every page. And you can go see, there's a documentary that's been done called Turn Every Page, which basically discusses the relationship between Robert Caro and Robert Gottlieb, who was his editor, who recently passed away. That documentary is actually done by Robert Gottlieb's daughter. It's a tremendous account about their working relationship and basically, all the years of them working together. And it's just incredible to see how Robert Caro has basically dedicated his life to this. I can't help but feel a tremendous amount of respect for somebody who's covered this for like 40 years. And he discusses, that writing is very tedious and it's very hard and it takes time. One of the big things that kind of caught my eye was every single day he basically would take an index card, and they didn't really talk about it in the documentary, but something I noticed is that he would take an index card, tape it to his lamp, and it would basically be his mantra for the day. Some of the ones I noticed said, whatever you put down on paper is good enough. All these kind of things where it just kind of keeps that discipline going, because as many of you know, if you listen to this podcast long enough, motivation is good. Motivation will get you started, but discipline is what gets you to the goal that you're trying to achieve. And so motivation doesn't last long enough. So motivation will get you started, but it isn't going to get you all the way there. So you got to have some discipline. So that's why I love, watching these or reading people who are doing this, or when I highlighted the documentary, Jiro, Dreams of Sushi, those kind of documentaries where you see people that you can draw inspiration from who have really spent, decades honing their craft. It's why I like, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and Guy Spear, and just people who I know are putting in the time to be the best that they can possibly be, constantly working on their craft to be kind of to be the best, to rise above everybody else. And the dedication and the day-to-day dedication that it takes is just absolutely incredible. And you just love to see it. And so the other one that, would be one that probably you wouldn't notice, but when I was in school at the University of Liverpool, there is a Liverpool Cathedral, which is the largest in Britain. And I think it's the 8th largest in the world. And when you go there, you'll see that there's like a plaque inside of it that talks about this bricklayer that basically worked inside that cathedral laying bricks for 40 years, which I just find absolutely, incredible. I don't think I could have that kind of dedication to do that. So, but back to these books, and you can watch, there's a ton of podcasts, ton of people have covered these. Robert Caro, he's written 6 books. Okay. He's written since 1974 to today. He has written 6 books, and he's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. So that's pretty good odds. That's a pretty good, pretty good odds there when you break it down. So the first book that came out, The Power Broker, is about Robert Moses and the man who built New York. And both of these books, yes, they're about the person they're about, but they're also about power and how it changes somebody and how that person changes as they start to accumulate power and kind of their real, their real intentions, if you will, come out. And so The Power Broker, it's, I got these numbers from the documentary, but I think The Power Broker is 700,000 words. I mean, this book is 1,200 pages, and Robert Caro cut out 300,000 words. And so when he decided to do LBJ, he said the only compromise he wouldn't make was cutting that many words again, which is why you get so many volumes. And of course, he said he thought he could do it in 3 volumes, and now here we are at 5, or, he's working on the 5th one. So, he definitely he is so thorough and so detailed that I'm not sure. I mean, no, I'm not sure, there hasn't been that much written about Robert Moses. There hasn't really been any other LBJ documentaries either, because he's so detailed and thorough that the amount of dedication it's going to take for somebody to get any more out of it is pretty incredible. But, Robert Moses used to drive around. He would think about these parks and all the things that people in New York who are very tightly contained, needing a place to escape. And so he started building, he started thinking about, okay, how do we build more parks for people? How do we get people out of the city? Started building roads, all of this. And then as he gained more and more power, he starts to basically disrupt neighborhoods, put roads right through somebody's neighborhood, throws these people out of their homes, moves them to different neighborhoods that he said was, as good. It wasn't as good. And he wouldn't reroute different lanes for these roads because his friends owned a building. All the things that we later on read about with politicians. And the way he did it was so cunning, and I don't really want to ruin the book for you if you want to read it, but he was able to use toll roads and use the money that came to those toll roads to be able to fund all the things that he was doing. And the incredible thing about Robert Moses is he was never elected. He was never elected. He worked for a ton of mayors of New York, but he basically insulated himself from their positions. The public, saw him building all these things, thought he was wonderful. The mayors of New York couldn't really touch him. Later on, he would always threaten to quit. And later on, somebody calls him on that, but he would always threaten to quit. Nobody wanted to be the mayor that kind of, was the one who booted him out. And so so he gains this power, but then later on, he thought everything was based on roads and building more roads. But as New York got, gained population, there's so many things he could have done with like the subway system, public transportation, and it made it so much harder later on for New York to build around the roads and bridges that he had done. Some of them fantastic, some of them not so much. And, there's certain things that could have been done to build the infrastructure for the subway system that later on made it so much harder and really caused so much more hardship for New Yorkers and for their commutes to get to work. And still to this day, there are people that are commuting a long way for their job in New York, Manhattan, to the boroughs. And it's all because of, it's still the the implications of some of the decisions he made are still there. And so then we go over to the LBJ books, which literally start with like his great grandparents, and showcase how poor he grew up, how neighbors had to feed his family in order for him to make it. His dad went broke, his grandparents went broke. I think he felt the weight of the name and the way that community members looked at his family. His dad was a state representative. He grew up going to the Capitol in Texas. And then he saw his dad lose everything, and he saw the shift in how people viewed him. He remembers being, super poor. And so later on, when he can become wealthy, even if it's not through the most honest means, he does so. There's the discussion on how he stole the Senate race with the stuffing of a ballot box, where literally the names on the ballot box that was stuffed were in alphabetical order in the same handwriting. And, I think some of them were even dead. The interesting thing about his stolen election, though, is that he did run for Senate earlier, and he lost, and the person who won stole the election from him. And so, there are some of these things when we look at them. I think in history, context gets kind of taken away. And so I'm not saying it was the best thing. I'm not saying it wasn't dirty. I'm not saying it was, wasn't illegal. But at the time, like other people were doing it, that's how he lost the first election. I don't know. It's kind of like steroids in baseball. These people get, they become the poster child for it, but everybody else was doing it too. So it was kind of a sign of the times, if you will. But the interesting thing about Johnson was, and with Robert Moses, is the fact that, they have this thing that they're wanting to do. They're having to let some of their true intentions lie dormant until they gain enough power. And then you all of a sudden become, who you really are, if you will. And I'm interested in this, in the fifth volume, which me and everybody else waiting for this fifth volume, because in the last volume of that he's written is The Path to Power, which is very incredible. It talks about, President Kennedy passing away, and then it covers the first 7 weeks of Johnson's presidency and how good he was at, keeping Kennedy's men on his team and doing everything he could to like rally the country and all of these things. So you have to think about that time, when Kennedy passed away, when Kennedy was assassinated, that was one of the first things that was ever on TV where it really just galvanized a country, where everybody could see it at the same time. Everybody's getting information at the same time, all the conspiracy theories coming out. And so it was absolute chaos. By the time LBJ took office on Air Force One and flew back to Washington, D.C., 90% of the country had already heard that JFK was killed. And that was, for that era, that was pretty incredible, right? That TV was able to make that happen. It's kind of like now with social media, how fast information travels. And so he really did have to do just an incredible job of that transition to power. And he also had to think about running for president very quickly because of kind of the timing on that. And then also getting civil rights legislation passed. You think about how he passed Medicare and Medicaid. And I think, it's interesting. My takeaway from this is how cunning LBJ really was as a politician, because if you think about it, he was a senator for a while. The third book in the series is called Master of the Senate, and talks about how good he was at counting votes, getting people to be on his side, being able to kind of, get these votes to happen, and really just an amazing job of making the Senate run. Well, when you look back through history, one of the hardest paths to president is through being a senator. There are very few times in American history where a senator actually makes it to be president. And so LBJ's thinking about that. And most of the time, the reason for that is because as a senator, you're forced to make votes, and you're automatically making one side feel good and one side feel bad. So when you run for president, you already have like 50% that are against you, and which makes it much more difficult than if you're like a governor or somebody like that. So LBJ's thinking about this. Kennedy's running for president. He looks at being his running mate, which most people would turn down because being vice president isn't a very good role. And he goes back and he looks and he says, okay, well, how many vice presidents have become president? How many presidents have actually died in office? And he looks at the odds of that and he goes, hey, the odds of this actually are not that bad. I could actually have pretty good odds. And so he breaks it down to that level, which I thought was interesting. But because of that, when he becomes president, he knows how the Senate works and the House works so well, so much better than most presidents ever do, that when it comes time for him to pass real serious legislation, he's able to do it. And I think that kind of gets left behind a little bit when you just look at the kind of the historical context that LBJ is viewed in. It's also really, really odd. So he passes civil rights legislation, which has a tremendous difficulty, and the Southern bloc, it was so good at blocking civil rights. And you think about just how paramount that was. So he passes civil rights legislation in the early 60s, and half the country, or the South of the country, really didn't want it. And you think about 40 years later, Barack Obama is elected president, the first black president of the United States. I mean, that's 40 years. In historical terms, 40 years is such a blink of an eye. It's pretty incredible. And then he also passed Medicare, which allows, older people to have health insurance, which I'm interested to see how he covers this in the 5th volume, because really the downfall to LBJ's presidency is going to be Vietnam and the escalation of Vietnam. And he starts lying to the American public. And it just really, that power, I'm guessing, you think you can get away with everything, and it really kind of diminishes a lot of, it really diminishes a lot of the good things that he did. But for that generation, Vietnam is such a, it's the thing that brought the younger generation in the 60s. It's what brought them together. But it's interesting because that really was such a horrible thing for their generation to go through, Vietnam, and the number of lives that were lost. And then now those baby boomers are now older, and the reason they have health insurance is because LBJ passed Medicare. So, as history goes by, it's interesting to see how those things weave together. Just like with Robert Moses and the power broker, and how New Yorkers have a much harder commute because of some of the decisions he made way back when. And so really, these books are about these men, and you gain a ton of knowledge about them, but it's also about, again, as I said in the beginning, about power, how power influences somebody, how it maybe takes things that were dormant in them and brings them to the forefront. LBJ voted down every piece of civil rights legislation until he had the power to pass it. And, it's like, okay, well, what were his true thoughts? Did he, which way did he really believe when he had that power and he passed it? Did he, was that something that kind of lay dormant in him? And so when you look, when he got out of college, he worked at a very poor school that was mostly Hispanics, and he saw how they were treated. He saw how he was treated when he was poor and the things that his family didn't have. And it's like, was he trying to correct those? Because that's the way he always felt. So it's a nice, it's just absolutely incredible. And the level of detail, and believe me, I've kind of talked up LBJ. There was a lot of things that he did that were really pretty poor as far as how he treated the people that were around him, his staff, some of the things he made them do. I always think there's a quote that says, you can tell a lot about somebody by how they treat people who can't help them. And that's, for me, that has always been a very good quote to think about. But seriously, just from a standpoint, and I am not an expert on writing, putting books together, but the level of detail that Robert Caro does on these books is nothing short of amazing for somebody to be able to do this. These are just incredible books. I actually did both. So if you're watching, I have the physical books, and I also listened. So I listened to the books and I read them at the same time to try to get through them because they're just that good. They're absolutely incredible. And when I started the LBJ series, normally I read kind of a couple books at once. I have a finance book. I have whatever. I just concentrated on them because years ago I had read the first LBJ book, which is Means of Ascent. I think that's the first one. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. Let me see. Sorry. Yeah. Or The Path to Power, I think, is the first one. But I read the first one years ago, or maybe 2 years ago. But I read the first one, and then I went away from it. And it was hard for me to kind of come back. So I just read it again, and then I read them all straight through. So I'm interested. I know that he's working on that 5th volume, as I said. And so we'll see. But really, if you're looking for a good series on power, history, how it influences people, and just really, really good writing, I would encourage you to check these books out. Robert A. Caro. Do a quick Google search. It'll come up. And if you really, kind of want to set the stage, you can watch that documentary first, Turn Every Page, which is pretty incredible. But again, to me, the lesson here is, as somebody who, the more I learn about finance, the more I learn about what I'm trying to do, sometimes I feel like every piece of knowledge I learn more about, I feel inside of me that there's so much I don't know. Following people like this, seeing people like this who have really dedicated themselves to something, I draw so much inspiration from that because, as I go through here, I just see how hard it is to keep that level of discipline up and to stay hungry and to really go after it, because not that many people do. And so for me, that's why I wanted to highlight this. I hope you enjoy this. Check these books out. Let me know. Send me a message, and we'll keep it going. So hope this has been useful for you. Don't mistake activity for achievement, as always, and I will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.